you think how long it takes for a group of meditators to become still, it isn't surprising when you think how long it takes for the mind to become quiet, to become still. And of course that stillness, that clarity of mind, still not there, you see. That stillness, that clarity of mind is necessary for any real insight, any... So stay there. So this clarity, we need clarity of mind, we need stillness to be able to see, to be able to understand. And today we try to understand through the passion and the death of Jesus. We try to understand one of the great mysteries of life, which is the mystery of suffering. So today is a day where we kind of allow ourselves to accept sorrow, and instead of running away from it or denying it, we face it, we contemplate it through the story of the last hours of Jesus. But we can't do that without feeling our own lives involved, implicated in this story as well. When we went through the stations of the cross, somewhat parallel to the stages of contemplation that we've been looking at during the retreat. In the stations of the cross, we reflect and genuflect at each of those stages where, in human terms, we might say, oh, not again, something else. There's one other thing has happened. And there are, of course, moments in life, certain days, where things seem to go wrong, one thing after another breaks down or doesn't connect, and things seem to slip into disarray. And in the extreme form, that is affliction, what Simone Weil calls affliction. And she makes an important distinction that I think helps us to understand the meaning of suffering. And she makes a distinction between suffering and affliction. She said, when you suffer, you may have a terrible pain, terrible toothache. And while you've got the toothache, that pain totally dominates your consciousness. You can't do anything else. You can't have a conversation, you can't do any work, you can't sleep. And yet it's only toothache. And with the right medication or a good dentist, that pain can be relieved. And once it's gone, you've forgotten it pretty well. It hasn't really changed you. It's just a bad memory that you can push away. But affliction is something different. Affliction is which does change us. It transforms us. And because it touches into every aspect of our existence, including our social existence, our relationship to others, to the society that we are embedded in, that we need for our identity. If you have toothache, you don't feel any shame in having toothache. Everybody has toothache. But affliction can really enter into our identity and begin to unravel, to take apart the self that we felt we were. Because so much of who we think we are is, of course, created within a social context, because of the reputation we have, or things people say about us, or the work we're doing, the recognition or the reward we get. And so much of our identity is, that seems so solid and so true, is actually dependent upon this very fickle and fragile foundation. Take away that approval, take away that recognition, and we very quickly begin to unravel like a sweater that's just beginning to come apart. You keep pulling at that one little thread, and the whole pattern begins, the whole thing begins to disintegrate. And I think this is what we see in the Passion of Jesus, and at each stage of the stations of the cross, we see another unraveling of the identity of Jesus in the experience of a total social death, really. I once went into Auschwitz, and there's one room there, or area there, where terrible medical experiments took place. And right underneath it there is a cell. There are cells where individual prisoners were held. And one of them was the cell of a Polish officer, I forget his name, who had been held there for some time. And he drew on the wall of the cell a little, very beautiful, small picture of a crucifix. And it's still there, you can see it. And in some strange way, it changes. It's very difficult to find the words for this, but in some strange way, certainly from a Christian perspective, it changes the meaning of the whole of Auschwitz. It did for me, anyway. And because I think the question we often face in many types of affliction, when suffering moves into affliction and we begin to unravel, to fall apart in our identity, the feeling so often is, God is absent. I cry out, and even Jesus felt this on the cross, why have you forsaken me? The absence of God. And the absence of God is a terrifying thing, because it doesn't mean that you don't believe in God, but it means that every idea that you had of God has been shot away, just been destroyed. We've got a van we picked up in Cork, and we've certainly a two-seater van, but we can pile in various unsuspecting passengers, sometimes into the back. And when you close the door, it is totally black. And it's very rare that you actually have this experience of total elimination of light. Even at night, certainly in the city, or even in the country, we're never really totally devoid of light. It's a sensory deprivation. I mean, people pay to have these experiences of sensory deprivation. You don't need to pay for it, you just need to get one of those vans and sit in the back. And actually, somebody discovered, after we had put many people through this ordeal, that in fact there is a switch in there, a light switch. And I thought, would that be a parable that we could reflect on today? And I think it's a false parable. It's a false consolation, because the much more real experience in times of affliction is that there is no light switch to turn on. There is just the total evacuation of the light of life. And so when Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" using the words of the Psalms, identifying himself with a collective experience of his own people, but he also resonates or awakens in us a universal human experience that is really necessary for us to understand. We have to make sense of it. We, of course, quite naturally and normally would avoid this experience for as long as we can. And maybe many of us will never experience it in its full force until the moment of our own death, which is for the preparation for our own death, which is often just that, an experience of affliction, when an old person begins to feel they're no longer useful. They become like a child, they're dependent on others, and their physical and social dignity is disappearing day by day. And hopefully they're receiving the angels who come and minister to us in our affliction, as they came to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, so that we don't have to face this, or they don't have to face this dying, this affliction, without some consolation. But even if the angels are there, in civilized society or in a good family, that's what we try to provide. We provide the human warmth, the human affection that can be felt even in the midst of affliction. But even when that is available, and when we do feel that, if we are really in affliction, nevertheless, the darkness is real and absolute. So, it isn't, as I said, it's even, if one can simply say, I no longer believe in God, or believe in any ultimate meaning in life, except some vague kind of cosmic confusion, but no real meaning, no meaning in my own personal experience of the last, whatever it is, of my lifetime, that really has just evaporated like the flowers, the lilies of the field. Then that actually, it would be easier to do. It would be easier to embrace nothingness, or the lack of meaning, than to face the absence of God, the feeling of the absence of God, while still believing in God. And that's, it would seem, what Jesus experienced, and no doubt what others experience in these times of affliction. What is interesting about affliction is that although it is related to physical suffering, and the body, it's not just mental suffering, it is the suffering of the whole person. When somebody has suffered a serious bereavement, the grief is felt as a physical pain, and it comes back periodically, like a visitor knocking on the door, with a physical manifestation, difficulty to breathing, a tremendous weight on the chest, the inability to get up and do anything. It's kind of almost a paralysis. And this isn't just a mental state, it is a whole physical grieving process. Nothing shows us more clearly that we are embodied beings. And yet, strangely enough, it's even in this physical manifestation that there is an access to meaning. This is what Simone Weil says about this. When an apprentice gets hurt or complains of being tired, the workmen and peasants have this fine expression, which is the trade entering into his body. The trade, the carpentry, the fishing, whatever it is, the farming, entering into his body. Each time that we have some pain to go through, she says, we can say to ourselves, quite truly, that it is the universe, the order and beauty of the world, and the obedience of creation to God that are entering our body. After that, how can we fail to bless with tenderest gratitude the love that sends us this gift? Now that is not an easy passage to understand or accept. But it does offer us, I think, the closest we come to an authentic explanation of suffering. You could explain suffering as God's way of testing us, or God's way of punishing us. But those don't stand up to our deepest understanding of God. So what she is saying is that this kind of suffering and affliction is the universe entering into our whole being. And if we understand that we are being, as it were, entered by something infinitely, unimaginably greater than we are, that's the pain. Joy and suffering, she says, are two equally precious gifts, both of which must be savoured to the full, each one in its purity, without trying to mix them. Through joy, the beauty of the world penetrates our soul. Through suffering, it penetrates our body. We could no more become friends of God through joy alone than one becomes a ship's captain by studying books on navigation. The body plays a part in all apprenticeships. Julian of Norwich, whose reflections on the Passion we listened to during the Stations of the Cross, was a woman of very deep Christian faith, of a medieval kind of vivid imagination. And she had prayed to God, out of her love for God, to give her a deeper and more personal experience of His love. And she felt that prayer was answered when she became very ill and almost died. And during those probably rather hallucinogenic days, she had these very vivid visions drawn from her own prayer, of previous prayer, and her deep reflection on the story of the Passion. Most of us in our style of religion now don't get into those images as deeply as they would have done in the Middle Ages, perhaps. So, anyway, this deep, sustained contemplation of the Passion of Jesus through her reading of the Scriptures had infused her imagination with these powerful images, and so they, during this time of ordeal, where her prayer was being answered, she visualized the Passion of Christ. But what is interesting is that although she was going through this, she knew that it was at the level of the imagination. So she knew, she wasn't saying this was actually happening, she knew it was happening in her mind and consciousness. But it had a reality for her and a truth for her nonetheless. So these images, these stories are sacred for that reason. You can't just say, oh, it was only the imagination. These are images of something true. And so when she recovered from her illness, she was changed by this experience and spent the next 20 years reflecting on what she had learned in those days or hours, and for 25 years I think. And she wrote one little book, The Revelations of Divine Love, which distilled this lifetime's reflection on her experience, and it's become one of the great texts of Christian spiritual tradition. And she's acknowledged as one of the great theologians, in fact. Her theology of sin, her theology of grace, her theology of love is magnificent, and born out of personal experience, it was for its day very advanced, and it got her into trouble that she hadn't locked herself up in a hermitage where nobody could get at her. So, and at the end, as we heard in the final reading from Julian, she finishes her survey of the world and the effects of sin on the world, for example, the suffering that she finds everywhere in the world. She says, everywhere I looked, I could see the effects of sin. But wherever I looked, I could not find sin in itself. Sin didn't exist as a separate entity or separate force that you could go off and do battle with, as it were. But the effects of sin were always there. In other words, sin is the result, or the effects of sin is the result of the illusion, which is the true nature of sin. The imagined distance from God, or the imagined absence of God. If we, in the back of the van, or at that moment of crucifixion, we imagine that the absence of God that we are experiencing is real, then we fall into sin. We fall into illusion. It's very understandable. It's very human to do, but we fall into illusion, and therefore our actions or our thoughts or our words become sinful because they're coming out of a state of illusion. If we sit in the back of the van or we hang on the cross, we go through these periods of affliction, bodily as well as psychologically, and we just persevere through them without surrendering to the illusion of the real absence of God or meaning, then something extraordinary happens, which is resurrection. If we go into any kind of death, any deprivation, any loss, with faith, there will always be resurrection. There's nothing else there can be. But if we lose that faith, and, as it were, slip into, understandably, but nevertheless disastrously, slip into this illusion, then resurrection doesn't happen. or doesn't happen yet, we actually sink perhaps into a deeper affliction, into a deeper darkness. We think, oh, not again, not more things are going to go wrong. My toilet flooded this morning. Then I couldn't get into the hotel to get the thing for the camera. Then something else went wrong. Then something else went wrong. So there are phases in which that is happening. And in fact, our life may end in one of those phases too. Well, in fact, our life will end in one of those phases. Where if we're dying peacefully in our beds, little by little, our bodily mechanisms will start to shut down one after the other. One damn thing after the other. So, if we can keep faith through that, then resurrection happens. And how do we describe resurrection? That's what we need to think about between today and tomorrow night. And most of the images we might like to use are false images. You know, like being in the back of the van and finding the switch. Oh, I found the switch! Okay. Don't have to be in the dark anymore. Well, that's maybe helpful, a consoling kind of image. Somewhere in the midst of all of this there is a solution. There is a way of getting out of this affliction. But in fact, the reality is that we don't get out of it, we go through it. And the transformation that happens as we go through it leads to what we call the resurrection, what we experience as the resurrection. But as we'll see when we reflect upon it later, there is no identifiable moment you can capture that you can say is the resurrection. There's no description of the resurrection in the Gospels. It happened, and we see the effects of it, but there's no description of Jesus jumping up and in the back of the van, in the back of the tomb, and finding the switch and pushing the stone away. It's not how it works. So we have to be careful about slipping into easy consolatory, maybe at times they're necessary, but easy consolatory explanations or solutions to this universal human problem of suffering, the meaning of death. Perhaps the best way we do have to understand it is through meditation. Because in meditation, in a gentle way, we are actually entering into this transformative process. Remember John Main's Christian insight into the meaning of meditation, that it is entering into a death and resurrection each time, the letting go, the taking of the attention off ourselves, the letting go of all the things by which we normally sustain or promote our identity. All of that is surrendered in the time of the meditation, in the poverty of the mantra, as much as we are able to do. That's the crucial thing. The difference between meditation and affliction is that we are choosing to do it, we are responding to the call to leave self behind. It's not happening to us. And of course, although we choose to do it, to leave self behind and follow into this dying to self, a good deal of us, a good part of us, clings to the very thing we're trying to let go of. And that's what we call distraction. That's why we feel at times we're not doing it very well, or we feel we're not making much progress. And instead of making that kind of evaluation, which is really an ego evaluation of meditation, we should reflect upon the meaning of faith. It's faith that takes us through affliction and death into resurrection, and it's precisely faith that we are practicing and strengthening ourselves in meditation. Faith is our capacity for commitment, our capacity for transcendence, and therefore faith is the necessary medium for love. So Saint Irenaeus says, the beginning is faith, the end is love. The beginning is faith, the end is love, and the union of the two is God. Now that might be a good little verse to memorize and ponder on today as we prepare for the liturgy of the Passion at 3 o'clock, and as we enter tomorrow into the great weight, the great day of faith, where we have to stay awake, be alert, not give in to despair, not to believe that the experience of absence means that what is absent doesn't exist. So it's faith that allows us to do that. It's faith that allows us to make loving human relationships and to stay in them and work at them through times of affliction or times of difficulty, so that we come through those times of difficulty into deeper loving relationships. It's faith that allows us to make a gift of ourselves to some work, some cause that we believe in and that we feel called to, that we can use our gifts for, and that we sustain that act of commitment and are faithful to that promise or faithful to that work that we've started. So this is faith. Belief is something else. But I think over these days of the Triduum, it's faith, really pure, naked, personal faith that we should be deeply concerned about. And the deeper our faith, the deeper our understanding. The clearer and the deeper our faith, the more we can make sense of the mystery that we are reflecting on these days. So let's take our time for meditation now. She makes an important distinction that I think helps us to understand the meaning of suffering. And she makes a distinction between suffering and affliction. She said, when you suffer, you may have a terrible pain, terrible toothache. And while you've got the toothache, that pain totally dominates your consciousness. You can't do anything else. You can't have a conversation, you can't do any work, you can't sleep. And yet it's only toothache. And with the right medication or a good dentist, that pain can be relieved. And once it's gone, reflect and genuflect at each of those stages where, in human terms, we might say, oh, not again, something else. There's one other thing has happened. And there are, of course, moments in life, certain days, where things seem to go wrong, one thing after another breaks down or doesn't connect, and things seem to slip into disarray. And in the extreme form, that is affliction, what Simone Weil calls affliction, which is sorrow. And instead of running away from it or denying it, we face it, we contemplate it through the story of the last hours of Jesus. But we can't do that without feeling our own lives involved, implicated in this story as well. When we went through the stations of the cross, somewhat parallel to the stages of contemplation that we've been looking at during the retreat. In the stations of the cross, we you think how long it takes for a group of meditators to become still. It isn't surprising when you think how long it takes for the mind to become quiet, to become still. And of course that stillness, that clarity of mind, still not there, you see. That stillness, that clarity of mind is necessary for any real insight, any... So stay there. So this clarity, we need clarity of mind, we need stillness to be able to see, to be able to understand. And today we try to understand through the passion and the death of Jesus. We try to understand one of the great mysteries of life, which is the mystery of suffering. So today is a day where we kind of allow ourselves to accept